Hi friends, back to our read aloud for today. We're doing Maze of Bones by Riordan, and we are starting on page 54 today. Amy wanted to hold the book forever. She wanted to devour every word her mother had written in it, but reluctantly she handed it to Alistair. "I want it right back," she insisted. "No fair," Dan said. Alistair put on his glasses and examined a few pages. Interesting. Several generations have held this book. These notes here are in Grace's hand, and here my father's handwriting, Gordon O. And here, James Cahill, Grace's father. They were brothers, you know, although Gordon's mother, my grandmother, was Korean. "That's great," Dan said impatiently, "but why was our mom writing about Ben Franklin?" Alistair arched his eyebrows. Obviously, Benjamin Franklin was a Cahill. That does not surprise me. He was an inventor, like me, after all. I would imagine most of the books in this library were written by members of our family, whether they knew their true bloodline or not. Amy was stunned. All of these famous authors? Cahills? Was it possible? Whenever she'd sat in a library, lost in books, she'd actually been reading the words of her relatives? She couldn't believe the Cahills could be so powerful, but Mr. McIntyre had told them their family had shaped human civilization. For the first time, she began to understand what that might mean. She felt like an enormous canyon was opening up at her feet. How had her mother known about the first clue years before the contest began? Why had she chosen to write this book? What did she mean by the Maze of Bones? There were too many questions. Meanwhile, Dan was bouncing around in his usual annoying way. "I'm related to Benjamin Franklin? You're kidding." "Why don't you go fly a kite in a storm and see if you get electrocuted?" Amy suggested. "Come now, children," Alistair said. "We have much work to do without bickering. We'll have to read through these notes and—" "Wait." Amy's whole body tensed. An acrid smell filled the air. "Is someone smoking?" Uncle Alistair and Dan looked around in confusion. Then Amy saw it. White smoke was thickening across the ceiling, drifting down in a deadly haze. "Fire!" Dan yelled. "Get to the stairs!" But Amy froze. She was mortally afraid of fire. It brought back bad memories. Very bad memories. "Come on!" Dan tugged her hand. "Saladin, we have to find him." That jolted Amy into action. She couldn't let anything happen to the cat. "There's no time," Uncle Alistair insisted. "We must get out." Amy's eyes stung. She could hardly breathe. She searched for Saladin, but he'd disappeared. Finally, Dan dragged her up the stairs and shoved his shoulder against the secret bookshelf door. It wouldn't budge. "A lever," Dan coughed. "There's got to be a lever." Dan was usually good at figuring out mechanical stuff, but they groped around for a switch or a lever and found nothing. The smoke was getting thicker. Amy pushed on the wall and yelped, "The surface is getting hotter. The fire's coming from the other side. We can't open it." "We have to," Dan insisted. But it was Amy's turn to pull him along. She dragged him back down the stairs. The smoke was so bad now they could barely see each other. "Get as low as you can," Amy said. She and Dan crawled through the library, desperately looking for another exit. She had no idea where Uncle Alistair had disappeared. The bookshelves were combusting. Old dry paper. The perfect kindling. Amy pulled herself up on a table and found the jewelry box. "Don't take valuables." She knew that was one of the first rules for getting out of a fire alive. But she scooped up the box and kept going. The heat was getting worse. The air filled with ash. It was like breathing in a poison fog. Amy couldn't even crawl fast because she was wearing her stupid funeral dress. She heard Dan coughing and wheezing behind her. His asthma. He hadn't had an attack in months, but this smoke might kill him if the heat didn't. "Think," she ordered herself. If she were Grace, she would never make a secret room with only one exit. Amy sank to the floor, coughing and choking. All she could see was the oriental carpet, a parade of woven silk dragons. Dragons, like the one on Grace's necklace. And they were all flying in the same direction, like they were leading the way. It was a crazy idea, but it was all she had. "Follow me," Amy said. Dan was wheezing too badly to answer. Amy crawled along, looking back now and then to make sure he was still behind her. The dragons led them between two burning bookshelves and dead-ended in front of an air grate about 3 feet square. Not very big, but maybe big enough. Amy kicked at the grate with her feet. On the third try, it rattled off, revealing a stone shaft slanting up. "Dan," she yelled, "go!" She pushed him through and realized with a start that he was holding Saladin. Somehow he'd found the cat, and the cat was not happy about it. Saladin clawed and growled, but Dan held him tight. Amy followed, gasping for breath. Her eyes felt like they were being sandblasted. They climbed up the dark shaft, and after what seemed like ages, Dan stopped. "What are you doing?" Amy demanded. The heat wasn't as bad as now, but the smoke was still thickening around them. "Blocked," Dan wheezed. "Push it." In total darkness, she crawled up next to him, and together they pushed on a flat, smooth stone that was blocking their path. It had to open. It had to. And finally it did, popping up like a lid. Daylight blinded their eyes. They crawled out into the fresh air and collapsed on the grass. Saladin got free with an indignant "Meow" and shot off into the trees. They were lying in the cemetery, not 50 feet from Grace's newly filled grave. The slab they'd pushed aside was somebody's tombstone. "Dan, you okay?" she asked. Dan's face was streaked with soot. Steam rose from his hair, and his clothes were even blacker than they had been before. He was breathing heavily. His arms bled from 100 cat scratches. "Think," he wheezed. "Don't want collect tombstones after all." Smoke poured out of the tunnel like a chimney, but that was nothing compared to what Amy saw when she looked up the hill. Her throat constricted. Oh no. The family mansion was a roaring inferno. Flames winked in the windows and lapped up the sides of the building. As Amy watched, one stone tower collapsed. The beautiful stained-glass windows melted. The family crest above the main entrance, that old stone crest Amy had always loved, crashed down and shattered on the pavement. "Amy," Dan's voice sounded like it was about to break to pieces. "The house. We can't let it. We have to." But he didn't finish. There was nothing they could do. A section of the roof crumpled, belching a fireball into the sky. Despair crushed the air right out of Amy's lungs like the house was collapsing on top of her. She reached for Dan and hugged him. He didn't even protest. His nose was runny, his lower lip trembled. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him it would be all right, but she didn't believe it herself. Then she noticed something that jolted her out of her daze. In the driveway lay a collapsed figure, a man in a gray suit. "Mr. McIntyre!" Amy cried. She was about to run to his aid when her brother gasped, "Get down!" He wasn't as strong as she was, but he must have been desperate, because he tackled her with so much force she just about ate the lawn. He pointed up the road that led through the hills, the only exit from the property. About 500 yards away, half hidden in the trees, a man in a black suit was standing very still. How Dan had spotted him so far away, Amy didn't know. She couldn't make out the man's face, but he was tall and thin with gray hair, and he was holding binoculars. With a chill, Amy realized he was watching them. Amy said, "Who?" But she was distracted by the chirping sound of a car alarm being deactivated. Alistair O., sooty and smoky, burst out of the mansion's main entrance and hobbled towards his BMW, cradling something against his chest. He looked terrible. His pants were ripped and his face was white with ash. Amy had no idea how he'd managed to get out. She almost called to him, but something held her back. Alistair staggered past William McIntyre with hardly a glance, jumped in his car, and peeled out down the driveway. Amy looked back towards the woods, but the man with the binoculars had disappeared. "Stay here," she told Dan. She ran toward Mr. McIntyre. Dan, of course, didn't listen. He followed her, coughing the whole way. By the time they got to Mr. McIntyre, the entire mansion was collapsing. The heat was like a new sun. Amy knew there would be nothing left to salvage. Nothing except the jewelry box she was still clutching. She set down the box and rolled Mr. McIntyre over. He groaned, which at least meant he was alive. Amy wished she had a cell phone of her own, but Aunt Beatrice had never allowed them to have one. She fished around in Mr. McIntyre's pockets, found his phone, and dialed 911. "He took it," Dan wheezed. "What?" Amy wasn't really listening. She sank to her knees and watched as the only place she'd ever cared about went up in flames. She pictured Grace telling her stories in the library. She remembered running down the halls, playing tag with Dan when they were little. She thought of the secret nook in the bedroom where she liked to read with Saladin on her lap. All gone. Her whole body shook. Tears welled up in her eyes. For the second time in her life, fire had robbed her. "Amy," Dan sounded close to tears, but he put a hand on her shoulder. "You've got to listen. He took it. Alistair did." Amy wanted to tell Dan to shut up and let her mourn in peace, but then she realized what he was talking about. She got unsteadily to her feet and stared into the distance, where the BMW's taillights were disappearing around a hill. Alistair O. had tricked them. He'd stolen the Poor Richard's almanac with their mother's notes, their only lead in the quest.